Well, exam revision for Comparative Swaziland in 1984. So this is your question. Rebellion is impossible when one doesn't know who can trust. Compare how this idea is demonstrated in these texts. So this is a question about humanity, or what we've talked about as human nature, okay? It's asking you to look at control. More specifically, we need to look at the impact of control. It's directing us here to look at trust, the loss of trust as being an impact of control. So I'm going to run you through 3 paragraph ideas, and I'm going to look at different essay questions that these paragraphs could potentially be manipulated for. So this is a how to answer this question screencast. It should be about 10 minutes. So I've put up 3 similar questions this time. So discuss how the use of power influences the lives of characters in 1984 in Swaziland, because we've got rebellion is impossible. What's the flip side of rebellion, I suppose? Well, for me, it's power, because power is what means that rebellion is impossible. Compare the ramifications. Ramifications is a nice fancy way of saying consequences that an oppressive political regime has on society. So what's the consequence of these regimes? What's the impact of the surveillance? So again, you could say trust is the impact, or loss of trust. And this final one says compare the extent to which hope is present. So I was thinking about it in terms of the loss of hope is seen through the loss of trust, and or you flip it and say in Swaziland, hope is present because trust is present. I hope that makes sense. That's 3 questions similar to rebellion is impossible when one doesn't know who one can trust. Here are my ideas when I first got this question. I was like, well, it's not from either book, okay, because it says this idea, and I double checked for you, okay, and this isn't a quote. So I was like, okay, so it just wants us to look at trust. So I was like, trust, or more to the point, mistrust is at the heart of these texts. So surveillance, propaganda leads to the citizens aligning themselves with the state or each other. I was like, rightio, I can do that. I can definitely talk about that in paragraph 1. That's a control paragraph. We've talked about that. We just have to say that control leads to mistrust, or control perpetuates mistrust. And I was like, well, we have to look at differences because this is comparative. It's no good if we just look at similarities. I was like, well, trust is possible, and so is rebellion in Swaziland because the regime comes to an end. All right, and I was like, well, I want to talk about Miriam and Charlie. I don't think I did that enough, actually, retrospectively. And of course, I need to talk about Winston and Julia because I need to talk about individuals and trust. I was like, okay, where do I go from there? So I came up with 3 key questions, and these kind of form the basis of my paragraphs. If I was to write a full essay, they certainly would form the basis of each paragraph. So how do these regimes eliminate trust, and what role does eliminating trust have on rebellion? So this idea that if you don't know like who to trust and your loyalty is in the state, then you don't rebel. What impact does the loss of trust have? So there I'm thinking like, well, it really impacts upon personal relationships, and personal relationships don't seem to be possible in these regimes, although disagree, they do seem to kind of be possible for Swaziland. And then, is it possible? Can personal relationships exist? Does rebellion exist? Does trust exist? For my 3rd one. So that's a forward versus eternal paragraph, basically. Here goes. So paragraph 1, surveillance and the climate of fear. So it's not enough just to say that there's surveillance, blah, 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 telescreens, surveillance, Stasi, you know, it's not enough. You have to say that this surveillance creates fear, okay? This is something we've tried to talk to you guys about this year. So surveillance works to generate mistrust, fear, and hatred in individuals. So the tally screens, of course, are the demand for control, and the tally screens also create this idea of mistrust because they don't know when they're being watched. And of course, this perpetuation of fear, thought crime does not entail death, thought crime is death. So the tally screens and the control lead to the elimination of trust in Oceania. In the GDR, Funda describes the Stasi as a bureaucracy metastasized. Metastasized is like a disease. It's a negative analogy there through East Germany. So this whole idea that the Stasi have really impacted upon society, and we see the really harsh reality of life under this regime. And then Funda says the Stasi were the internal army by which the government kept control. She's trying to show the limited ability to exist freely here. And of course, we really see this in Orbach's cellar, where Miriam tells Wunda that everyone suspected everyone else, and this complete mistrust that exists. You could also talk about Hagen Koch, whose wife divorces him or is forced to divorce him. Then I want to talk about personal relationships, because I think this whole idea of rebellion is impossible when one doesn't know who one can trust. How is this demonstrated? How is this idea that rebelling is impossible? Well, I think through personal relationships we see attempts to rebel in both texts, but they don't succeed in 1984. So I was thinking about not just relationships in terms of like man and woman or man and man. I was thinking about like the family. So in terms of the Parsons family, okay, who spy on their parents. Of course, we have to look at how trust is eradicated through, I guess, the eradication of love and marriage and anything that they can't control. So they have to make sure that trust is, non-existent. So therefore relationships have to almost be non-existent. It's this removing all pleasure from the sexual act. And then I was like, well, how do I look at personal relationships in Stasiland? What do I want to say? And I was like, I kind of want to look at the opposite, the fact that rebellion exists in some ways with Julia and the Italian boyfriend, because he's not, approved of. But more to the point, she does trust him, or at least she doesn't betray his trust. So I was writing about Julia and I came back to this idea that there was no question for Julia. She would not inform on him. And then flawed versus eternal trust doesn't exist in 1984. It does in Stasiland. So I wanted to look at this whole idea that rebellion is possible, of course, because no one thought it would all come to an end. But the fact it's a retrospective text shows rebellion obviously was possible. The regime finished. Trust is still present. Miriam maintains a love for Charlie. Frau Paul's being reunited with Torsten. I didn't end up writing about Miriam and Charlie, but obviously we've talked about that a lot in class. So if you're confident doing so, I absolutely would want to write about Miriam Charlie, because she never gives up on him and she does not believe that he hung himself, so that's trust. But I really love writing about Frau Paul and this whole idea that she had the right courage to do the right thing by her conscience. So refusing to betray Michael Hines shows freedom, shows humanity, and more to the point, it shows the failure of the Stasi. Alright, but Orwell presents this eternal rule where trust doesn't exist, because of course Winston betrays Julia's trust and rebellion is impossible because Winston's mental process is basically defeated by O'Brien in room 101, and there is no way the party can be overthrown. So I hope that makes sense. Just want to come back quickly to this whole idea that you can use these ideas. Of course, you have to manipulate them each time for really similar questions. So power, oppressive regimes, hope, and then of course we talked about rebellion being impossible. I hope this helps. My advice to you right now would be to go and write an essay, okay, on this question or on one of the 3 questions that I've put here. Good luck, Year 12.